Hello and welcome back. I am your host, Heather, and on today's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. I really wanted to talk about this case because of the controversy around these cases, and I spent weeks researching it, and I still find them really odd. I'm also going to do this in two parts because it's a lot of information, it's a lot to cover, and there's lots of little things, and I didn't really want to edit those out. Today, we're going to talk about the suicides of Phoebe Handsjuk and Baillee Schneider from Australia. And suicide in itself isn't unusual. It's actually really sad and unfortunately more common than we'd like to admit. In Phoebe's case, suspicious circumstances surrounding her suicide have always haunted the Handsjuk family. Then 9 years later, Baillee's parents, the Schneiders, would also question their daughter's suicide. The biggest coincidence in both of these girls' deaths is that they both were dating the same man. First, let's talk about Phoebe Handsjuk. Just a few weeks before Christmas, on December 2nd, 2010, Phoebe was found dead on the ground floor garbage room in the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Ant Hampel. Ant and Phoebe met through a mutual friend in 2009. She was 23 at the time, and he was 43 at the time. They started off as friends, but things would move quickly as they would continue to see each other over a 6-month period before Phoebe moved into his luxury high-rise apartment, the Baillee in Melbourne, Australia. They had been together for around 20 months, so almost 2 years, at the time of her death. But throughout their relationship, Phoebe had been struggling with alcohol abuse, drugs, and fighting off severe depression. She was regularly seeing a therapist as well as a psychologist, and it said she was actively trying to get her life back on track. But despite her struggles, friends would say that she had an electrifying effect on people. She was beautiful and had captivating eyes, and she was also said to be adventurous, but she also didn't get persuaded to do anything she didn't want to do, meaning she had a bit of a stubborn streak. She loved kickboxing and had fast-tracked through her training to obtain her black belt in 2 years. Being that she was quite active, she often walked to work. Not only was this because she loved to, but it was also a way for her to help fight off her depression. Ant Hampel comes from a very well-to-do family. He is the son of Professor George Hampel, a retired Supreme Court judge, and Ant is also the stepson of County Court Judge Felicity Hampel. He has a sister named Christina Hampel, who at times was very close with Phoebe. But not only is Ant the son of two very successful, well-respected judges, he is also a party promoter in Australia. Phoebe did try and contribute a small amount of money to Ant to go towards rent, but she often couldn't afford to do so. She worked part-time as a receptionist, but she often missed work, especially near the end of her life, due to her depression and drinking, and that's according to Ant. In the months leading up to Phoebe's death, Ant and her would break up several times. She would leave the apartment, once staying with her grandmother for up to a week, but she always returned back to the apartment. Ant would say that they were trying their best to work on their relationship, and he even had planned a trip with her to Paris right after Christmas. He would say that she was looking forward to going to Paris. But friends would say that Phoebe was actually struggling with her relationship with Ant because she loved Ant, but she just didn't see herself with him long term. She confided in her brother that she actually wanted to break up with him, but she didn't really know how. Phoebe thought he was very controlling, and it worried her. Every time they did break up, Ant would talk her back into the relationship. And this was probably stressful. Now, we truly don't know what the fights were about or who would apologize to who, but I'm sure a lot of us can relate. Sometimes toxic relationships are the hardest to get out of. We love that person who we don't get along with, and it results in breaking up and getting back together. And Phoebe can't tell us her side of the story, but Ant would say their arguments were mostly about her drinking. On Monday, November 28th, 2010, just 4 days prior to her death, she had gone out with Ant on a double date with friends Julie and Mark Rockman. Her friends would remember that Phoebe wasn't really in a great mood that night. It also seemed that Ant wasn't allowing Phoebe to talk much. Julie thought that perhaps Phoebe wanted to open up to her about something, but Ant would interrupt or control the conversation. Phoebe ended up drinking way too much, and Ant would apologize for her behavior and take her home. They would get into a huge fight in the car, and Ant would also say they continued this fight at home when they eventually got tired and he went to bed. Phoebe did not go to bed. Instead, she left the house. Phoebe met up with her friend, Brendan Hessen. His recollection of that night was that Phoebe seemed fine. She was in the mood to drink, but he doesn't really recall that she even got overly drunk or seemed depressed for that matter. She also didn't want to go home. He also mentions that Ant continuously called Phoebe while they were together. It turns out he didn't just go straight to bed, as phone records would later show that he called over 29 times in the course of an hour. If you do the math, that's about one time every 2 minutes. While Phoebe and Brendan were hanging out, she talked about plans to return to Malakuta as well, where her family lived. Her grandmother would also later say that Phoebe was offered a job working at a local golf club in Malakuta. Phoebe had worked there in the past and had really enjoyed it. Knowing that information, we can only assume that Phoebe was thinking about a fresh start, and perhaps she was getting her ducks in a row before finally leaving Ant. That night, she would spend the night at her mom's house instead of going back to the apartment. Phoebe subsequently missed work the next day at her receptionist job, as well as the following day, which was a Wednesday. Ant would say she was on a drinking bender and was barely at home at all in the few days before her death. Wednesday morning, a few of her family members received a very strange text message. It would say, quote, "Hi family, I'm in bed and about to sleep, and when I wake, I will transform into the most incredible human being you've ever seen." Not, "I will go to hospital. It's safer there, and I hear the special tonight is tomato soup. Delicious, nutritious. I love you all very much, but not enough to send an individual text. Sorry about that, but time is sleep and I must be on my way. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. XO." Phoebe had gone back to the apartment Wednesday morning after the strange text was sent out, and Phoebe's mother was understandably worried about this message. But she was about to board a plane, so she called Phoebe's grandmother to ask if she got the message too. Phoebe's grandmother did, as did her father, and they all seemed really worried as it just seemed very out of character of her. Phoebe's grandmother would call Ant to see if she was okay. Ant said he would go to the apartment and check on her. Some reports would say it was unclear if he went back, but other reports would say that there is a card swipe at 12:40 of him entering the apartment. But even after reading the inquest, it's still unclear to me if he actually did, and there's no mention of her condition at that time when he did supposedly check on her. Ant would also say he assumed Phoebe's strange message meant that she was okay and finally home, but he could see why it may have seemed differently to her family. Ant would later tell police that Phoebe told him that her iPhone wasn't working properly and it needed to be repaired, so he agreed to take it in before work. Originally, he said that happened Wednesday morning, but after reviewing the timeline with police, he later suggested that it was probably more likely Thursday morning that it was brought in, but he couldn't really recall. Despite there being the strange text that wasn't followed up on, there's no receipts or records of the phone being dropped off either to confirm which day it was actually brought in. Ant's house cleaner, Shelley, would come to the apartment Wednesday afternoon to do her scheduled cleanup, and she initially saw Phoebe sleeping. But when Phoebe woke, they had a conversation where Shelley would say that Phoebe seemed okay, not depressed, mostly tired, but just like a normal hungover person. And Shelley asked if she could get anything for Phoebe, and Phoebe would politely decline. Shelley wasn't worried and didn't think that there was anything wrong. Ant would say he came home from work on Wednesday evening and would claim to see that Phoebe was still sleeping, assuming she was sobering up and still coming out of her drinking binge. When she woke up, he allegedly cooked her dinner, she took a bath, had some vitamins, and called her dad from bed to wish him a happy birthday, and made plans with him to see him for dinner the following night. Then Ant would say she fell asleep and slept through the night. Thursday morning, Ant went to the gym in the apartment before going to work for the day. He would say that Phoebe was sound asleep when he left. Phoebe would then be seen leaving and re-entering the building after a fire alarm around 11:50 a.m. This was also seen on CCTV footage at the apartment. There was evidence that her computer was used again at 12:01 and 12:02 to create iMac files for GarageBand. Files weren't created again until around 6:19, 7:01, 7:39, and 7:40. Ant didn't call her throughout the day either Thursday. He claims he didn't try because her phone was in the shop. But he also didn't bother trying the landline either. Perhaps he thought she was okay. It's not said whether he regularly checked on her or not, so I don't know what's normal behavior. Thursday night, Ant would come home just after 6:09, and there's a recording of his car being swiped in the car park at that time. But Phoebe wasn't in the apartment. He would see broken glass on the kitchen floor, a second glass with what appeared to be vodka, a ripped cushion, which he assumed was from the dog, Post-it notes laying around the apartment floor, blood on her computer keyboard, and a strange shrine on the bed. Her purse was also still in the apartment with her keys and wallet. This shrine that he spoke of would have photos of him and Phoebe and the dog, and Ant would say also little notes of her ramblings. Candles were lit and her hair straightener was also left on. Around the time that Ant returned home, there was another fire alarm at 6:05 p.m., but it's unclear if residents were exiting the building again at this time or if Phoebe was trying to make her way out as well. CCTV footage would be lost, so we really don't know who was coming or going other than Ant's card swipe at 6:09. It's also said that the program that records the card swipes wasn't working properly that day, so people were able to enter the building without any record. Phoebe was supposed to be meeting up with her dad for dinner at a Thai food restaurant. Remember, it was his birthday. Her father had called Phoebe's cell phone at 6:51 to touch base, but he would get her voicemail instead. Strangely, Ant would call him back exactly 1 minute later. Len, Phoebe's dad, took note of this because Ant never called Phoebe's father. He doesn't remember ever there being a time when they spoke on the phone. When Ant called Len back, he would tell him that Phoebe wasn't home, but her stuff was all still in the apartment, so he assumed she would return home soon. Now, it's unclear if Ant mentioned the blood to Len, but the fact that Phoebe wasn't there, even though her stuff was, worried Len enough to suggest that Ant call police and report her missing. But Ant insisted that she would be back and it was too soon to call the police. Now remember, Phoebe's phone was apparently at the repair shop, so Ant wouldn't have known that Len called. Ant would say it was just a coincidence that he called Len. So why did he call him? If there was candles lit, a hair straightener on, and he thought that she was coming right back, what would he need to call Len for? Wouldn't he just wait and tell Phoebe to call her dad back when she re-entered? When questioned later during the inquest about why Ant called Len, Ant would say that he called Len because he wanted to know if Phoebe had gone to dinner without him. To me, that's weird. Phoebe's purse and wallet were still there, and he originally thought that she would be returning. But if her stuff was still there, then why would he think that she left without him? I don't know. That whole thing doesn't make sense to me either. The iPhone would also be an issue for Phoebe's family. It would be a part of all the unanswered questions that didn't make sense to them. Phoebe's family later recovered the phone from the shop a few weeks after her death, and they handed it over to police, but that phone strangely has since gone missing, along with all of the CCTV footage from that evening. While Ant was home waiting for Phoebe, he would go on to use Phoebe's computer. Remember, there was files created at 6:19, 7:10, 7:39, and 7:40. When asked about this, he said he was just looking for evidence as to what Phoebe could be doing. Ant talked to a work colleague at around 7, and then at 7:10 accessed a program called iMovie. He told police he only used files that were already open on the computer, and her Gmail was said to be open as well, but when they finally did investigate the computer, it seems that all of her emails were deleted. Ant would also order takeout food for just himself. He would have a cigarette and a beer while waiting for Phoebe to come back into the apartment. Now, why didn't Anthony walk around the apartment to look for Phoebe? If her keys were still in her purse, it's possible she was still in the apartment. Maybe she locked herself out. Maybe she was with a neighbor or in the lobby waiting for him. Apparently, you needed a card to use the elevator, so it's really surprising to me that he didn't try and look for her. He didn't go and check to see if her bike was still there. He didn't ask neighbors if they saw her. Why did he just sit in the apartment having a beer? Also, why did he only order food for just one person if he were meant to go out for dinner or if he thought Phoebe was returning shortly? When his takeout food for one arrived just after 8 p.m., the delivery person had apologized if his food was cold because he had to park all the way down the street and walk due to a large police presence at the apartment. When Ant heard from the delivery driver that police were all over, Ant would go down into the lobby and speak with police. He would learn that a body was found in the ground floor garbage room at 7:09 p.m. by the concierge. Ant would then tell them that his girlfriend was coincidentally missing, and together they identified that it was Phoebe based on the description of her tattoos and a photo Ant showed them of Phoebe. Ant never personally identified the body. He would just go back up to his apartment and phone his parents. At this point, the garbage room in the basement was the only room secured by police. The rest of the building was not. So people were still coming and going, including Ant's family who came to the apartment. His apartment also wasn't secured despite there being broken glass, a strange shrine, rambling notes. There was a few photos taken, but it was never considered a crime scene or an area to investigate further. The garbage room on the 12th floor where they lived also wasn't secured, and neither was the elevator or the car park, despite there being blood found in these locations as well. The concierge initially found Phoebe at 7:09 p.m. She wasn't able to open the door to the garbage room because something very large was blocking the door. She then peered into the window on the door and noticed a large body and large amounts of blood all over the room. She immediately told her supervisor, who called the police at 7:15. Strangely, emergency services didn't attend to Phoebe when they found her. When police arrived first, they didn't even touch her body. They didn't feel for her temperature, and they didn't look for a pulse, rigor mortis, or anything. There was a lot of blood, and I guess it was apparent to them that she was dead, but it's proper protocol to check for life or the temperature of the body. Ambulance services also weren't allowed to assist and were instructed to wait for the detective to arrive before doing any investigation. And had they felt for a temperature or examined her at all, it would have helped them figure out a smaller window in which she had died. All they knew was that she died sometime between noon when she re-entered the apartment from the fire alarm and 7 p.m. from when they found her. And that's a pretty big window. And this is where we're going to take a break and end part 1. I'm sorry. Next week, we're going to dig deeper into Phoebe's death and also discuss the suicide of Baillee Schneider. Hit subscribe so you don't miss part 2.